we're going to go high level again. So we've been sort of bouncing back and forth today between the details of actually running simulation models and sort of discussing the overall context of COVID-19 and of agent-based modeling. And so now we're going to go in the opposite direction from these technical considerations, and we're going to look at a diversity of in-depth views on the context of what we're doing here. I mean, what can agent-based modeling hope to accomplish, and how does it look from diverse points of view, such as epidemiology, blockchain networks, economics, and social science as a whole. So I'm about to turn things over to our moderator for this panel, Gina Smith. So Gina Smith, I was very happy to recruit as a moderator. I've actually been on a couple of panels that she moderated at Boao Forum in China, which is sort of the Davos of China. But she's moderated quite a few panels at various events before, and done TV news and written Steve Wozniak's biography with him, and done a host of other really amazing things. So I'm really happy to have Gina here to help guide this conversation. So
yeah, and I'm so honored to be a part of this, and for Ben to call me to do this, and looking at your bios. I mean, wow, I think we're really well qualified here to discuss the role of simulation, positive and negative, regarding the COVID-19 pandemic. I liked Ben's idea. I was going to try to introduce each of you based on your bio, but I think it might be actually useful if you all could go around, maybe starting with Vinay Gupta, and then moving on to Anish, and then Mircea and Nabarun, and then finally, and then just talking a little bit about your background and how it relates specifically to COVID. And then, I think it'd be great to just talk generally about the range of this pandemic and how simulation so far has served us and not served us, from that million-mile point.
Quick check, my audio is okay?
You sound perfect.
Okay.
And then Gina, how long are you thinking each panelist should take for this initial intro?
Just a 50-word intro. Who are you? What have you been working on? Would you rather me do the intros of you guys? I'm happy to do it.
No. All right. So we're looking at one minute or two for each person.
Yeah.
Right,
last 30 seconds. No, 30 seconds.
Let's explore, guys.
Oh, Vinay Gupta knows what the story is.
Yeah. Nobody cares who we are.
They care, but it's more important what you say.
Yeah.
So Vinay, why don't you kick us off?
Sure. So Vinay Gupta, CEO of Mattereum, which does digital identities for physical things. But 10 years ago, I was a worst case scenario modeler planner, and I did extensive work on very serious worst case scenario pandemic flus.
So that makes you really a worst case scenario planner is absolutely the right person to be talking about COVID today, for sure.
Well, I mean, to be honest, COVID is so mild that I would not have regarded it as being worth doing serious scenario planning for. The stuff that I worked on in those days was like, 2 billion people you'd die in the first year. So I feel a little out of my depth at this point.
Yeah, but in terms of your relationship to the humanitarian angles of all of this, I was just watching the news this morning. There's armed gunmen storming the government offices in Michigan. I mean, it's nuts. But we'll get back to you, Vinay. Let's move on. How about Mircea?
Yeah, thank you so much, Gina. It's a real pleasure to be here.
A new PhD, congratulations. Just got your PhD from Princeton.
Well, I
Not
guess in
that
relative
recently.
terms, I got it about a year and a half or two ago, but no.
Pretty
Nowadays,
recent.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I did my PhD in collective behavior and ecology. So I was looking at how groups coordinate, how do they share information, and particularly looking at this from the perspective of the evolution of multicellular life. But as you can imagine, a lot of these models on collective behavior and emergent phenomena are widely applicable to many different fields and systems. Since getting my PhD, I've taken the scientific framework and mindset and this modeling approach and applied it to a variety of different industries. First, as a consultant in analytics and data science at Applied Predictive Technologies, which is part of MasterCard now. Exactly, yeah. And since then, I have specialized a bit further into the financial services industry, where I now lead big data innovation and do a lot of analytics and data science type of work at Fair Square Financial, which is a financial services company on the East Coast of the US.
Okay, and so you're using data science there to understand customer behavior. And what, you're in the Philadelphia area?
Exactly,
Philadelphia,
yes. Yeah.
Okay, that's great. And moving on, how about Nabarun Dasgupta? Hi, Nabarun.
Hi there. Good afternoon or good evening to wherever you are in the world. So I'm an infectious disease epidemiologist. I'm at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, which is in the southeastern part of the United States. And I've been doing infectious disease modeling for, I don't know, about 15 years maybe, and have used agent-based models for different types of modeling projects, but kind of I'm agnostic to a particular method. And in terms of specifically around respiratory disease and coronavirus, I've been an advisor to CDC, to WHO, and other organizations looking at influenza and looking at understanding the statistical complexities of prediction models and understanding for influenza and for other respiratory illnesses, and consulting with our state health department here, and have a data lab where we're analyzing the mobility data to understand kind of how different mobility data sets make a difference in how panicked you are about what to do about next stages.
Yeah, and talking about next stages is something we definitely want to kick off with you, Nabarun, and talking about the limitation of current simulation models and how they may not be looking or are not looking far enough ahead. And so, for sure. So we'll get right back to you on that. Thank you, Nabarun. And Anish Mohammed is here.
Hi.
There he is.
Yeah. So myself, if I am to do an intro.
Well, you've done everything, haven't you? You've been a doctor.
Yeah. So this is a tricky bit. So agent-based simulations, most recently, initially I used it for malware analysis and things like that. And for the past 3-4 years, there's this thing called cryptoeconomics and token engineering. So I've used that extensively for doing a whole bunch of modeling. And most recently, I did very small amounts of work because of my, collaboration with my folks back home. I'm from a state in India called Kerala. So the people who run the show over there are all from my med school, the med school I went to. So I had a bunch of questions. And then after that, I did a small amount to try understand what the hell is happening in India. And to me, most of those things hasn't worked out the way I wanted. So I have more questions than answers. So I'm a skeptic.
You're a skeptic about agent-based modeling in general?
Yes.
Or
unless you really, really understand the constraints, I'm deeply, I've entered the space from cryptanalysis. I've done a whole bunch of big data and anomaly detection. So for a large UK retail bank with like 10 million customers, I built an anomaly detection platform. So I'm very aware of constraints of data modeling in that sense. When you do agent-based models, it is really tricky to get any real, real endpoints in that sense. And I don't know, like there are more experts in this group who could actually give us more insights than I have.
Yeah, that's something I think everyone has been emailing me about. It's just the difficulty in identifying the correct parameters and knowing what to look at. And it's different in different geographies. Like maybe we can kick off that way. I was looking at the latest numbers this morning. It's morning my time here. Regarding the coronavirus. And now you can look at Hong Kong, where I am, and you guys know we've got a population of 7.5 million and just 1,039 cases and 4 deaths. We're about to open back up. That probably is unwise, but we can talk about that too. Then you take something like India, right? 33,062 something cases, about
Yeah.
1,000,
Less
more
than
than
1,000.
1,000.
Less than
Yeah,
1,000. Yeah.
less than 1,000 deaths. I mean, and like, look at the population of India. Then you have China. Now look at the U.S., where 2 of you are, right? 1,039,909 cases as of this morning. More than 60,000 deaths. What I want to ask each of you quick is, what's your view on how simulations have so far served us in these different geographies? And where have they harmed us? I mean, for sure, I see it just on the social networks. People have the wrong idea already about immunity, based on what they're reading, So maybe we can start there.
Yeah.
Um,
If
maybe
I'm
from
allowed to
that
go. Yeah, so
Yeah,
go for it.
anyone can start. Go ahead.
I was about to say the worst case in my mind is UK. So forgive me if I say this. In the UK, the advice, both of us, I mean, at least 2 of us, the panelists are from UK. So I know Vinay is a friend of mine. So we had some advice that was actually given to the government based on, I assume, some sort of models. And there was a prediction of herd immunity, which really, made the whole situation worse. And just to add to this, having looked at India, the situation in India seems very, very peculiar. Every model I've tried so far doesn't seem to really represent what's actually going on in India. And that seems a mystery to me. Just to give you some context,
Yeah, please.
just because of the lockdown, there was a decrease in traffic, death by traffic accidents, right? That actually has gotten reflected in the total number of deaths. So that's how different India is. But there's a very important thing I should bring to everybody's notice. The life expectancy in India is, less than 70 years. And 72 years was the median age for hospital admission in the UK. And I shall stop there and leave it to everybody to explain what my story is.
All right, comments?
Yeah,
Vinay?
so
Okay.
I'm happy to walk through kind of the perspective from financial services on simulations. And I think it goes a bit to Nabaroon's point that there's actually, I think, a fair bit of skepticism because people are concerned about whether we can ground the parameters correctly. There's a lot of interest right now in figuring out how, essentially, what are the economic knock-on effects of, say, the lockdown in the United States. I'm going to speak from the United States because that's where I and my company actually work.
Right.
And there's a big concern of, what does it mean when this happen, when we have this recession that is caused by this type of a pandemic? Because
this is a different kind of recession, right, than any recession we've seen before. So you can't model it based on previous parameters.
Yeah. And there are some people who are saying, well, there are some similarities to, say, let's say the .com bust, because what happened there was, again, you had a lot of unemployment, but it was very localized, and it's quite different from what we're seeing, where you have it across the entire multiple sectors of the economy, the entire geography. So from a financial services perspective, like, we're very interested in looking at what are the causes of strain and what are the indicators of strain and stress on customers, and seeing how are they affected by the situation. And unfortunately, because ABMs have not been very promising in the past, or let's say they've been treated with skepticism by a lot of folks in my industry, we really have a lot of models industry-wide. I'm speaking industry-wide. Generally, a lot of the models are built on historic data, which now, if you run predictions in a very new environment, you kind of wonder, like, well, how do I interpret these results? Are they even accurate? Can I make some sort of just like a top line adjustment? And I think this is where the promise of agent-based simulations can come into the industry. But again, I'm very much in the same boat as Nabarun, that you have to get the right assumptions right, even the right scale right. Like what is the agent that you're simulating? Yanir Baryam mentioned you could simulate the individual, you could simulate a community. Should we simulate it at the level of a city economy? There's a lot of factors, and I think we're kind of playing catch up with the situation to figure out how to set these up.
Well, and do banks and financial services, and well, anyone else for that matter, do they really have the expertise and the resources and the infrastructure they need to make that leap to agent-based modeling?
Oh,
I mean,
they do. They actually, financial engineering actually has enormous amount of people who do stochastic processes. So as somebody who has worked with a bunch of funds and people like that, I can assure you the largest number of PhDs, Goldman Sachs, if you compare the total number of people there who are probably PhDs, probably they have more than Twitter, more engineers than Twitter. So, we should not underestimate, I'm probably Nabarun and other people will say, Vinay would say, from what I've seen, they definitely have the people. The question is incentives and, what are they optimizing this for, right?
Right, and is it for individual behavior or the behavior in aggregate? And it's the individual stuff that's tough, right?
Yeah.
Also, they're used to modeling wallets, not immune systems.
Exactly.
Right. There's there might be a similar basis of mathematical technique, but beyond the very, very basic, broad mathematical approaches, everything after that is extremely specialized. Could we hear from you on that? You're the expert here. Take us through how this whole mess looks from your perspective, please.
Sure. And I was actually well, I was actually going to say, I don't know anything about how dollars move, but I do know about how viruses move. So I appreciate hearing you guys' perspective too on this for sure. I think going back to Gina's original question of how have the models been useful and where have they not, I think the example of the UK in late February, the model talking about herd immunity had a lot of influence. I think that was fairly quickly shot down, but I think it was soon replaced by the Imperial College of London's model, which was in terms of the science, it wasn't like the most stunning science, but in terms of a political and getting people's attention, it was invaluable. And I think, regardless of the technicalities of that particular model, it served a great purpose of being a wake-up call. And I have to admit, I've only had time to look at US and the UK numbers and dabbled with a little bit of the India numbers, but really my focus has been on the US numbers. I think what has followed since, one of the fascinating things is the idea of flattening the curve has become a phrase that I could not have imagined a few months ago that people would be talking about flatten the curve. But I think flatten the curve, as useful as a concept as it is to prod people into behavior, has two really strong flaws in the analogy. The first is what we call right censoring. And so that is basically, if you let the models run for a longer time, you'll see most of them are showing a rebound increase in the number of cases kind of right after like 2 months or whenever kind of you stop looking at the model. And so letting the models run for 2 years, and of course you're losing precision, there's errors that are accumulating on each other, so you have to be careful. But kind of one of the problems with the models I've seen so far is that they're so short term that the seasonality component of it isn't properly modeled into it. So at least
to illustrate that, Nabarun, you pointed out to me that there was that New York Times, the Nick Kristof simulation based on the work of Delamek and Fisman. And so that convinced everybody, yes, we need to shelter for 2 months versus 2 weeks, but the data was available in JavaScript. And people went in there and said, well, wait a minute, the minute people get out, unless there's a vaccine or the infectious agent is wiped out, we're basically screwed again. And, that's why it's going to be worse. But that message doesn't get out to regular people.
It doesn't. And then the second kind of failing of flatten the curve is a area under the curve problem. And I'm using a technical term because we're in a technical audience here. But basically the way the models were presented, it was like, here's the peak if we don't do anything. And here's the peak if we if we stay at home. But if you look at the amount of solid
Total area.
color under those lines, the total area, that represents
Much
the
bigger.
number of cases, right?
Yeah.
And the way that it was presented to the public was that, oh, this big peak, it has a lot of solid color. This little peak has less solid color. And it's kind of just, it's coming back to bite us now, because as we were talking about taking away the restrictions, we're not remembering that the point of flattening the curve wasn't to eliminate transmission, it was to let transmission happen slowly. And it's going to be about the same amount of transmission and probably around the same number of cases. So we need to, at this point, I think there's some models, and I can talk more about that in detail, but kind of people have got this idea stuck in their head that by flattening the curve, we've kind of finished our responsibility now that we're beyond the first peak.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean,
go ahead.
oh, the thing which is hardest for people to understand is that it's always like day zero, right? Like, from the virus's perspective, it doesn't know that we flattened the curve. We didn't flatten the curve. All it knows is, look, hey, fresh meat, right? There is nothing in the situation has changed because we temporarily socially distance. If we go out and do exactly what we were doing before, we're going to get exactly the same results that we got before. And I mean, the epidemiological characterization of the virus still seems to be very, very messy. Like, I mean, the R estimates seem to range from about 3 to about 6 or 7.
Massively, yeah.
Right. The case fatality rate seems to be, depending on where you're looking, I've seen pretty good data for about 0.3%, right up to 4 or 5%.
Double digits in Iran, almost.
Yeah, double digits in Iran.
Yeah, almost, yeah.
Right.
So the thing I was about to say is, like, it's very much dependent on, and when you were talking about flattening the curve, I think it's just trying to do constraint optimization. The constraint is you have a healthcare system with a bunch of things that will help people survive, and like try, get people through this thing. And that's the only thing I see. And it could be going out in cycles. So it's just a resource constraint. Like, when the resources are out, we will effectively have to do whatever we need to do.
But I mean, how do we do any kind of modeling at all for something where your choice of the underlying parameters, depending on which set of data you pick? And I mean, I literally have no idea.
That's my question. That's my question, exactly. How can you do it at all?
Dr. Epidemiologist, take it away.
Yeah. How can you do it at all?
If you figure it out, let me know.
Yeah.
And the other danger with these models too is it gives the public the wrong idea. I mean, if I could go on my Facebook, it's horrifying. I grew up in the South, in the American South, all these people, we got to get to herd immunity. People just got to be brave and get out there. And it's like, there's no science behind, how long these antibodies can protect you, if they do, what this immunity looks like. For all we know, it could end up like dengue fever. We don't know. But when people see simulations and scientists later change their mind, they don't see the scientists correcting themselves. They get that in their head. And can we be more careful about our simulations?
So I think that you kind of nailed a very important point, which is that the general public has not the best grasp of uncertainty. I mean, if you even just think about how many people interpret the forecast, like 80% chance of rain, and then it doesn't rain, and therefore you lied to me.
Right.
Man, you're triggering me. You're triggering me. I feel extremely triggered.
I lived in Oklahoma for 5 years. When people would get so angry when there wasn't a tornado. Damn news station. I'd be like, you're right.
Yeah. But I think for us, what we look at, especially, I mean, we don't look at in terms of cases and the epidemics. Vinay was exactly right that we look at wallets, and general economic trends. And I think essentially the best approach that we can give, given all this uncertainty, is to really try a big sort of a shotgun approach, try multiple scenarios, and see essentially, even in worst case scenarios, how likely are you to make it through this, basically, as a company, as an organization? What is the financial strain that's going to be? What if we assume unemployment is actually going to increase to like 2x as opposed to x, and I think, like, to a certain extent, as was pointed out, like, actually in financial services, we are very prepared to think about these types of uncertainties. but it's hard to communicate that across and make the uncertainties be transparent. I think a lot of people think that we are making prophecies, whereas instead we are just trying to find, well, what is the range of possible outcomes, and are we going to be safe anywhere in that range?
Yeah.
Yep.
That's right. I think Anish said this earlier to me, and if it wasn't you, then who was it? But somebody emailed me and said, you know, these models, they're not the truth. They're just models. And there are useful models and there are excellently useful models,
Yeah.
you know, but they're just models. I mean, models didn't help us get here right now.
That's right.
I mean,
That's right.
despite what we knew about what was happening in Hubei.
Dr. Dasgupta, what is the current state of the art model? Like, what is the model which is currently most sophisticated, and how does it differ from the modeling that we were seeing, say, a month ago or 6 weeks ago?
Right. Which
Great
models
question. Yeah, I think, well, working is that's a whole other bar, but the model that I trust, and I've only looked at, I mean, I've looked at all the ones that are public open source, the major ones. So I've only kind of been hands-on with about a dozen of them. So there's definitely others out there that, you know, I know I'm missing. But I think the one that I find the most compelling is the one by Kistler et al. Out of Harvard in Science. And it's published about 2 weeks ago. And it is the most rigorously peer-reviewed model that has come out to date. And I think it differs in some very key ways from all the other models. One is that they modeled the two previous beta coronavirus outbreaks that we had good data for, and we were able, you know, and so I think the benefit of doing that instead of just looking at SARS-CoV-2 is that we can look at seasonality and kind of the longer term picture on those. So another thing is that they varied R0, so the reproductive rate. They let it fluctuate instead of saying like, here is R0 for this virus. They let it, you know, be different at different times. And I think that's a key concept where we, you know, where I think some of the more casual conversations have kind of, you know, have been trying to pin down, like, here is the R0 to plug into a model, and really should be conceptualized as a range depending on season and scenario and country. So I think those two things are great. The other thing that they did was they spent a lot of time really thinking about what seasonality means for this virus. And so they use a term called seasonal forcing. And it's a fancy way of saying a specific kind of seasonality. So we know that from observation that all lambs are born in the spring, right? So there is a biological phenomenon of when certain biological things happen at certain times of the year. So they were kind of looking at what a seasonal kind of back with a vengeance model would look like in the fall. And not just with a vengeance, but kind of a tepid back, you know, back to say hi kind of model as well. What's really fascinating about what they came up with is that it is possible, and this was kind of a shock to me a little bit because I've been, you know, saying like, oh, social distance, we should do this for a while, was that we can actually social distance for too long, so that the peak of the infections in the fall might actually be too high for the healthcare system to handle. And I printed it out. I don't know if this will work on here, but basically, here, I'll try this. But
you could share your screen too, if you have
Oh,
that on
yeah.
the screen.
That would have been a good idea, except for that I'm on my phone because it has a higher resolution than my computer screen.
It's okay. It's okay.
I'll try to
pull it up.
All right, sorry. So basically, like, these dark bars are kind of how long you've been social distancing. And so we have like 4 weeks, 8 weeks, 12 weeks, something along those lines. And what you see here are these peaks in the fall of number of infections in hospitals. And what I can post a link about this, but basically what you see is that there's kind of like a Goldilocks zone where if you go beyond it and social distance for too long, there's going to be not enough people getting sick during the summer so that the virus will be able to rip through the population faster in the fall and cause a peak that's actually higher than what we can handle. And so the Goldilocks zone is around, is between 8 and 12 weeks. And so After 8 weeks of social distancing, I think some of the conversations about opening up actually have a very strong scientific basis in, which was, not what I went into the model thinking.
How does the model approach technological change? So, right now we've got probably, 25 or something like that candidate antiviral treatments.
Mm-hmm.
Do any of the models that you've seen have a kind of stochastic model of how long it will take to, trial these things, what the odds are of any of them succeeding, how that model's in? Because, it seems like we're in a position where if you social distance until there's a reasonably effective treatment, job is good. If you social distance, there is no effective treatment, you hit the middle of winter and then the damn thing just rips.
Yep.
Now what do you do? And this is the stuff that particularly fascinates me, that we've got probably half a dozen things to worry about here other than viral transmission. And I've never seen a serious modeling effort on that entire front. Anytime I wind up doing that stuff, I wind up just knocking it out in Excel and pointing at the boxes where I made up numbers and just being like, guys, and you could get a little insight from that. But, I probably started panicking about the food security stuff that I knew was coming over the horizon about 6 weeks ago.
Yeah.
Food security, here we go.
Yeah.
And now you see the kind of wave of freaking out about that. And, I know there are people doing numerical modeling of the food security, but it bothers and annoys me that we don't have any kind of integrated modeling capacity. Like, I want to see the food security model plugged into the epidemiological model, plugged into the financial model, plugged into the drug trial.
The complexity would just explode, right?
Well, but how else?
Put, yeah.
But how else do we provide any kind of meaningful steering surface to decision makers? I know the complexity is horrible, but if we don't provide anything at all, what are they left with? You pull some tarot cards out in the morning and that's how we pilot our societies?
I don't think that's probably what it is. It's like if you do simulations and you get bounds, most of the things have bounds, and that's probably what's going to be useful. What probably will be very difficult, just to throw something, a spanner into the mix. Imagine mutations, right? So when you have these models, if a mutation kicks in, the mutation could literally take the model off the plane straight out. Okay. So there are a whole bunch of variables. This is what I was saying. Like when you create a model, you really have to have a bunch of constraints, and the constraints drive how the model evolves. And Nebron is probably far more experienced than I am. I've done it only for a very different set of things, and I know how complicated it can get. If you plug in multiple models in, and it's just a product of probabilities. Bullshit in, bullshit out. So, add bullshit into the mix. Anywhere where things are not really matching reality, we will end up with a totally different set of results, with absolutely nothing to do with what we ended up, starting out with. And again, one of the things we really need to understand is modeling, in many sense, have no explainability attached to it, and that's literally what Nebron was like, kind of. Hinting at, without saying, obviously. It's very polite.
That's well put.
So one way that we try to get some form of confidence in our results is to essentially try multiple approaches, if you have the resources to approach that from a modeling perspective, and see, do the numbers at all hit the same ballpark? So for instance, in our industry, you could think a lot about say, customers and how are they maintaining their, you could try to model out, say, the balance that people are keeping in their loans and how they're paying and how they're buying things. Or you could try to model it out at an even more granular level, like what is, how frequently do people make a certain a payment? You could go to like individual granular levels. You could go to a spatially more coarse-grained level, and see basically how does that, what results do you get when you vary the scale of the simulation? Do they at all fall in line? You can look at the numerical simulation versus an agent-based simulation. Look at different techniques of agent-based simulation. So for instance, you could look at a hidden Markov model versus just a very sort of a simple rule-based system. And I think ultimately it comes down to, like, there is a lot of uncertainty And the only way you can get any sort of confidence on is if you've tried multiple different approaches and you feel like you're landing in roughly the same spot in the simulations.
Do we expect simulation technology to markedly improve as a result of all this? I mean, and I'm always kind of comforted by, knowing that, Isaac Newton worked on calculus while he was social distancing from the plague. Shakespeare, an earlier round of the plague, wrote Hamlet, or not Hamlet, Macbeth, I guess, when he was when the theaters closed in London as a result of the plague. I mean, do we expect the state of the art in this science to markedly improve so that we can simulate like you're talking about?
So I think actually we are witnessing that revolution in the social sciences. And certainly if you consider scholars like Yanir Bar-Yam, Duncan Watts, a variety of others, I mean, I always think of to the perspective that when we consider the social sciences like sociology, like economics, it actually started out envious of physics, of Isaac Newton, as you will. Basically, the sociologists and the economists thought, well, physics has fancy equations to simulate a system. Why don't we pretend that we can do the same thing? But that was putting the cart before the horse because the data were not there. Like physics was based on centuries of observations that things fall down, this accelerates. Like we don't have that type of observation in economics, but now we're starting to get there. We're starting to get the data, and we're really actually starting to create stimulated universes in a way. And I don't mean like everything in the universe, like everyone's hair color or things like that, but you can see some really exciting work coming out of, say, Microsoft Research Labs, Google Research Labs, that are all about, let's say the question is, what will be the most popular song in the in the world? Is it based on the song's characteristics or is it just random chance? They actually simulated that with hundreds of thousands of people and they got to the bottom of that. And similarly, you could.
What was the answer to that, though?
It actually is just a matter of luck. Like it's basically
if you might happen to be the right place at the right time. Yeah.
When
Exactly.
winner stays on the table, right? It's an avalanche.
Exactly.
So,
but getting back to the coronavirus simulation, I think you can actually end up in a place now where you can simulate a city. You can simulate agents walking in a real landscape and essentially look at probabilities of, you create these agents that follow rules, that have cultures that are not very are not just rudimentary, dots in space, and you can actually get that level of detail in there, and you have the data to ground the assumptions.
Yeah, I mean, the tricky part with all this is the epidemiological relevance, right? I mean, certainly the defense folks have been doing, agent-based modeling of things like urban combat in a really intense way for quite a while.
Quite a long time.
I'm sure that work is as classified as all hell, but we kind of broadly have an outline of what's happening there. I mean, the thing that I really want to drive home on, because I'm aware that we're running out of time, is like, what's actually coming next in this, right? I mean, do you feel like the models have reached kind of terminal velocity and they're about as good as they're going to get and we're just waiting for more data? Or do you think that there are substantially more accurate models which we're going to see in the next few weeks or month, coming out of the research?
Oh, good question. So,
well, yeah, I mean, I really want to know this stuff. That's why I'm pushing.
It's a good question.
I think there's going to be, in the Northern Hemisphere at least, I think there's going to be a lull in models. Because in my experience, and again, like it's very, particular to influenza and kind of some other types of infectious diseases, but related enough. What I've observed is like, so let me just give you a little context. So I worked with CDC on a project forecasting it, looking at influenza forecast models for the states in the United States. And we had like 30-something teams across the US using agent-based modeling, traditional SIR modeling, even like a mechanical Turk, ask the internet user whether they think it's going to go up or down, right? So they use like all, it's like, whatever, it's worth a try. It was it was before COVID, so we didn't think there was quite so much of a risk, or we didn't have to kind of get it together quite so quickly. But what we found across these 50 models that we looked at every week, and this was in last October, the state of the art, going back to Gina's question, was being able to predict 2 weeks ahead whether the number of influenza hospitalizations was going to be either just higher or lower than the week before, right?
Wow.
So all these models, the best they could
Just a
do
Boolean.
was
That's all they could do.
that.
Just
That
a
was
Boolean.
like,
Yeah.
and they had like long, they generated long probabilities, but the way that the cleanest interpretation was basically, is it going to be higher or lower? And that didn't even go right a lot of the time. And so to go from that.
Yeah, it could get half of like tossing a coin.
Right. It was definitely better than that, but sometimes but no, it's a good point, Anish, because it's not it was like a toss of a coin, but it was a weighted coin. So the models were very concordant with each other, these 50 or so models, on upswings and downswings of curves. But they were terrible at predicting a future peak. And so I think as we observe what happens over the summertime in the Northern Hemisphere in terms of whether how strong the seasonal forcing effect is, we're going to have to retune all the models. So I think we're kind of like in a, I don't know, I think there's going to be like a tail of like an academic publishing tail of models coming out, but in terms of like new real models, we probably won't have a good sense for a few months.
I mean, I want to sort of square this against one of my friends is an Icelandic MP, and they've got really pretty decent data. They're down to roughly 0 new cases a day. Sometimes it's 1, sometimes
that's
it's 3.
a very different population, Vinay. They have 300,000 people that genetically very, very closely related.
Absolutely, but what they do have is they have a nicely sealed border. Got good quality, not perfect, but pretty good random testing. So they got a good idea about how many people were infected. They've got excellent data on how many people got sick.
Fatality was very, very low. It's less than 0.03.
This is the R6, CFR 0.1 model, right? So what I wanted to drill down on is this: like, if we do agent-based modeling of the CFR and CAR that we have from Iceland, and then we rerun that against someplace like Italy, there's just
I don't think
we could get these numbers to match.
Absolutely no, it won't match. I ran it, so I can tell you that.
You see, exactly, right? So one of the other ways of using modeling is that you can look at what happened, and then you can say, well, we're going to run the model until we get a model that matches that data, and we can run these things backward as a way of taking an estimate with the CA or CFR, right? And I mean, weather modeling, people do this stuff all the time, right? Like, hey, so this is what happened, and we're going to run this over and over again. And if we take that sort of an approach, and I haven't seen anybody actually document that, but it seems like we're going to wind up with very concrete estimates on what CFR and CAR actually were in a lot of the places where we've got kind of weaker data. And
I think we're on a risk here, right? What you're kind of referring to is like make random assumptions and run things and get to a state where the state will true.
But what I'm driving at is this, right? The massive size of the anomalies that we've got in CAR and CFR, how many people get sick and how many those people die. The massive anomalies that we have in that, like New York is a crater, right? Why is New York a crater and Chicago is not a crater? What is happening here? And
there's theories about different mutations, right? The Chinese mutation is different than the European mutation, which
lots
is
of
more
models.
deadly.
Is it particulate air pollution? I saw a nice piece of work suggesting that the virus was sticking 2 bits of air pollution hanging in the air for a long time. The thing that I'm trying to point out is this, right? We just seem like there's a big knowledge gap there. And I am very worried about that knowledge gap. Like, I feel like we're approaching a position where, the politicians and the general public all have a basic model of, we kind of do some social distancing, we do a bit this, we do a bit that. But I have this just little kind of alarm bell in the back of my head of like, wait a minute, we haven't pinned down a whole bunch of the fundamental questions. You see what I'm saying? Could you speak to that some? Because I'm out of field here, right? You're right in the middle of this mess. I'm basically a fossil in this work. Contextualize, please.
Yeah,
I agree with you.
Could you speak to it, Navroon, and also could you talk about, a real world takeaway? What should we be telling the populace? What is the messaging out of our lack of knowledge here?
All right. So I think I think Vinay, your question is spot on. I think there's a more fundamentally simple explanation is that we're looking at the wrong numbers. So the numbers of, it's like, just because the numbers are accessible doesn't mean they're like the numbers that mean something. They are ranges, they're estimates, they are dressed up as counts, but the actual number, there's some of the models I've seen that are saying like for every one detected case, there's 10,000 that have not been detected. And if that difference is like actually 8,000 versus 10,000, those make huge differences mathematically, right? They totally explode your model. So at the end of the day, I mean, there was a lot of blowback from when Trump was asked, like, what is the metric that you are looking at to reopen the country? And he said, the metrics are in my head, and pointed to his skull, right? And it was like kind of this classic, like, oh my God, did he really say that? But as like a quantitative epidemiologist, I kind of agreed because the numbers that we have are all subject to selection bias in such a strong way, and a particular kind of selection bias called diagnostic suspicion bias, where people who are sick, are certain types of people who are sick are the ones getting tested. And those are basically conditional probabilities that make it really difficult to understand what the actual numbers are. The closest analogy to something that's an established part of epidemiology to this is looking at prognosis. So a prognosis and a risk is very different, right? So you found out that you got tested and you found out that you have this illness. You want to know how long you might survive. And so everything that you're observing is conditional on being tested, right? And so the types of models that are used for that are all Bayesian and not frequentist, and to be able to kind of think about it as priors. And so I kind of see the count data not as a stochastic count, but more as a conditional probability of having been tested. And so I don't know, maybe there's some way forward on that.
Is it okay if I add something to the whole context? I think the real challenge here is, a whole bunch of opposing constraints that are being applied upon. So, when you look at Bayesian and you look at this diagnostic test and the sensitivity and population distribution, all of that is contextual. And, you give the same data to two different set of people, they will come up with two different set of conclusions. And this is actually being driven by politicians and, in an adversarial sense, by the market. If the market goes down, people make money. Market goes up, people make money. So the people who make money are very much interested in movement. Essentially they need news. Good or bad is a secondary story, right? If there is news, the market moves. I can see Barron laughing because he literally is thinking what I'm saying, right? Like this is, and probably Mirza is going to say the same, and he will probably give us some insights. And literally, this is a challenge. We have a very tight boundary. We can actually say to a population, do this, do that. There's a very important thing that, Vinay kind of mentioned, but he didn't go to details. Starvation kills 100%, okay? If you're starving, the probability of your death within a bounded period in time, weeks, okay? If you have water, a few weeks, okay? 100%. So that is a reality. So the trade-off between, and humans are pretty bad at understanding Bayesian probabilities, right? As in like probabilities over time, in any sense, like, you're going to have hunger, you're going to die. A virus, there's a probability I will die. What do you think is going to happen? And that's where the real knife edge sits. The moment that tilts and death by starvation happens, this whole system is going to collapse. So for us, the real tight upper bound is, if we have lockdown, what fraction of the population will get to a point where we have death by starvation? And once, death is open possibility, nothing could stop humans in that sense.
And I mean, the East African situation is kicking off right now. They have locusts, they have floods. I can't remember.
Fires.
The coronavirus. I mean, they're really getting pounded here. The locust thing is incredibly scary. It really is piling up in a very disturbing way.
Are you some of these related to climate change for sure? The fires in Australia, perhaps the locusts. No one knows, right?
I wanted to go back to the point on the conditional probability, and in particular the diagnosis versus what the reality is. And in particular, I think there's actually some interesting parallels between this and what we see in the financial world as well. Because as you can imagine, in a similar way that epidemiologists are very concerned about how a disease is spreading, we are also very concerned about how financial strain is spreading throughout an economy. And one of the things that we look for, and a lot of banks have started doing, especially in the US, is making essentially keeping track of how which customers are asking for financial assistance. There are a lot of programs that have gone up to try to deal with the sort of incoming, if not already here, financial recession, like economic recession in the US. But the question is always, given who is raising their hand and, and indicating that they need assistance, you always have to ask, well, what does that say about the general population, the general consumer? What does that say about the prevalence of financial strain in the economy? And can you actually rely on, like the nice thing about epidemiology is that you can rely at least on a diagnosis as being a pretty honest signal. But in the case of financial systems, in the case of consumer lending, in the case of customers, people who might be asking for help might not actually need it. So you need to set up a system that when people make this request, it's a very honest one. And then you can use that data to try to back out, well, given what we are seeing and of the prevalence of requests from help from this particular customer segment, can we back out like what the actual underlying prevalence of that is? Like what do these people look like? Do we have lookalikes to these known stressed individuals? So I think there's a lot of Bayesian inference, unfortunately, behind looking at these signals, like confirmed cases or confirmed cases of financial stress.
Yeah, we have some questions from the audience. You guys want to take them? I'll field them for you. I think we've covered this a bit, but one is, what are the limitations of current modeling techniques and how can we do better, asks a viewer. And we've talked a little bit about just the length of modeling and the type of parameters you have. What else? Who wants to take it?
Of what type of modeling, sorry?
Current modeling. What are the limitations of current modeling techniques and can we do better? We've really talked around and around this, but what's a nice pithy answer? The limitations are we don't know enough and the models don't go out long enough?
Yeah, I mean, computational complexity would be the simplest answer to that. It's very much tightly bounded on how much, state space we can actually go. If you had a quantum computer and you could actually run the simulations, we might get better resolution in shorter periods of time. But in theory, all the
sensitive dependence on initial conditions is what really screws us.
Yeah.
Another one, this is an interesting question. Which moral and ethical values do you panelists think we should adhere to when making decisions about health and the economy writ large?
Wow.
Yeah, I can
I know.
tackle that.
I love that question. Go ahead.
Yeah, so about 12 years ago, I did an ethics review of pandemic influenza preparedness plans and looked specifically at what was the frame of ethics what was the ethical frame that was being used to make decisions a priori in the plans. And the utilitarian frame was the one that was most often cited and kind of explicitly talked about when it came to rationalization of healthcare, of like vaccines and other kind of ventilators and other kind of technology pieces.
The utilitarian, the needs of the many outweighing the needs of the few?
Mm-hmm. Yes, yes, thank you. I think what's actually really interesting is kind of the way the bioethics has evolved since those pandemic influenza plans came out. And in the current phase, we actually just finished up a ethics review on this, and it's in publication now. But in the current situation, I think the health equity frame of ethical
Lost your
reasoning,
audio. Can you guys hear me?
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me
Might
still?
be muted, yeah.
Yeah, you're clear.
Yeah, you muted
You're
yourself
clear.
now,
Yeah.
Barron.
Yeah.
We can hear you here.
Okay.
Just, I think they had a glitch
Okay.
on.
Yeah.
Got it.
There
You're
you
saying
go.
health equity?
The health equity lens. And so basically, it's looking at how different specific groups that are, higher risk or more vulnerable, however you want to call it, just like looking at how the decision disproportionately impacts different groups of people. And if you kind of go with that lens, it actually favors, so if social distancing, at least in the United States, becomes a voluntary activity, so the restrictions are lifted, it's basically the people who are richer are going to be able to social distance longer and more, right? So then if we are still, we're still kind of working with herd immunity, right? As a concept, as a base concept, where what will happen then is that the poorer people in the society are the ones whose bodies are literally going to be used to build the bulwark against the virus over the summer. They're the ones who are going to get sicker over the summer and are going to, the rich people who are not putting themselves at risk are going to be benefiting from that kind of
shield,
that immunity, right?
Yeah.
So
Although,
I think, it favors, I think a little, sorry, I'll just finish real quick, but I think it favors, less of a phased opening and more of a quicker opening. So anyways, that's just from that position.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to talk about the herd immunity thing there for a second. So, I mean, at the end of the day, if we had a genuinely random baseline of who was going to connect with who, herd immunity in that model would make a bunch of sense. In actual fact, right, what we have is kind of weird, complicated, high-order graphs, small world graphs, however you want to think about these things. There is no herd immunity for the debutante set in, New York or Connecticut, right? Because they're never mixing with the people that went out and worked in their gas station jobs and got herd immunity. If those populations stay indoor until Halloween and then all come out in costume, they're going to get wiped. Because the herd that they're part of has no immunity, right?
Yeah.
And this is one of the things which is most frightening, which is, the actual complexity of the real world is not insubstantial. And every time we get hold of a nice reassuring model which tells us that things are going to be okay, it turns out to be a total lie, right? Like, the bottom line is that a bunch of people are going to get sick, and that's going to continue until there's treatment. We could talk about herd immunity, but herd immunity is a statistical truth, not a personal one.
Yeah,
and
the confirmation bias, right? It's a confirmation bias. We everybody is wanting to have something, and we are trying to fit models to tell us what we want.
Everybody's trying to grab some kind of truth that they can be comforted by.
Yeah.
But the thing which is frightening is that the models which are being grabbed by the politicians and being grabbed by the public are so oversimplified that they're indistinguishable from lies.
Yeah, I mean, mostly it's lies.
There's a little of that going on as well. Like, the herd immunity thing, is just like, there are actually no herds, right? Like, well, why is it that in Sweden, the immigrants have 10 times the death rate of the Swedes? Well, it turns out they were all talking to each other, and a bunch of them caught it, and then it circulated inside of that community at a very high rate, in the same way that it's hitting the Hasidic Jews in a lot of places.
Yeah.
Tightly knit communities, lots of personal contact.
Yep.
Large family groups that are sharing, large houses, all of these
sharing food, touching each other constantly. I mean, this doesn't happen in other parts of the world. It's like I've lived both in New York and in Sweden.
I mean,
it's like a huge difference.
The frosty Japanese who are bowing to each other from across rooms. Social distancing was not much of a change in Japan.
They always wear masks, so it's like no new thing for them.
Right. Versus Italy. So. I have a worry here that we're in a position where epidemiology is being, kind of misused in the same way that economics often are. The government will be like, hey, well, we've run the model and it's very important that we starve your grandmother to death by cutting her benefits, because it really does show that austerity is going to come out and, change everything. And it turns out that there wasn't an error in the spreadsheet on the austerity paper. Does anybody remember the name of the paper?
No.
Yeah, so the UK government's austerity work was based on a paper that turned out to have a modeling error in the Excel spreadsheet. They've looked off the end of an array or something like that through the entire thing. So my worry here is that what we're going to see is, like, the governments will simply pick the model that gives them the excuse to do what they want to do.
They already do, right? It's in the UK, you are not going to get a ventilator if you're over 70. So as far as I know from all my classmates who work over here as clinicians, if you are a patient, you have ARDS, if you're over 70, you're pretty unlikely, even if you're well off in the UK, you don't.
The New York model is that 90% of the people put on ventilators die on ventilators. Like, at that point, you probably don't want to be ventilated, even if you look like you're dying. But what I'm going to really drive at here is the politicization of the modeling. Right. Given that none of the models are accurate, I feel like there's just a tendency for the politicians to punch in the numbers and give them a policy that they want and then run with it. Any comments on that?
I think that's what's happening.
Question.
Yeah,
I mean,
it's a
here's
confirmation
a
bias.
version of your question is, all you guys personally, knowing what you know about the limitations of the models out there, what are you personally doing? Are you going out, or are you wearing a mask all the time? I mean, how are you treating this in light of the political skewing that Vinay mentions?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of talk about, when can we go back to normal? And, like people are just waiting for this thing to be over, like kind of a bad nightmare. And I think really like that's definitely not me. And I feel like we do need to take this very seriously. In terms of my personal precautions, I mean, life has changed for me dramatically in the sense that when you go out, like I wear a mask. I try to avoid crowded places. I try not to do grocery shopping on my own if I can. And I do feel lucky that I have the privilege to do that. There are a lot of people who unfortunately cannot do that. But I do think that this is something to be taken seriously. And even if you are uncertain about an outcome, I would say that this kind of goes back to like sort of the thinking of Nassim Taleb and black swans and kind of like gambling. Like, you only need to go broke once to lose the game, right? So even if you think the probability is low, why would you continue to play that game? In that regard, I think being more precautious and looking at models and cultures where this has worked. People have mentioned Japan. People could look at Taiwan, where people wear masks and they're very precautious about this because they learned the lessons back during SARS. Yeah. You can look to those models to see something that works. And it's actually not a very big sacrifice if everyone does it and does it properly. I mean, I have friends now in Taiwan who they go to restaurants together. Life is almost returning to normal in a lot of ways because
I was going to tell you that in Hong Kong, and we've had 4 deaths for 7.5 million people, but we've all been wearing masks since the 20th of January. Restaurants never closed here. The mall never closed here, but everyone wears a mask. And when someone tests positive, they're not allowed to go home. They go to a hotel, a quarantine hotel.
Yeah.
And I think maybe that's the biggest difference, is people being willing to change.
I mean,
Can we get back to the ethical and moral implications for a second? Are there, I think that is really resounding with our audience. Are there any final messages we want to talk about here, what people should think about ethically?
Yeah, so I like to think of this from the perspective of John Rawls and the veil of ignorance. So the idea is, when I look at this policy and I think, well, if I were in another position, if I were to just be randomly placed in this society and have this policy, would I want to have this be enacted upon me, right? Like if tomorrow we decide, okay, everyone just goes back to work and we're going to run it with herd immunity, but maybe I'm lucky enough that I can just stay at home and work from home. I have to really think about the people in general and how would I feel if I were on the opposite side of that equation in another position? And I think really we have to think about that, not just as individuals, not just as governments, also as companies and businesses. We have to think about how do we move our employees back into work and business as usual. At my company, we're actually talking about, do we go back to the office? Do we not? How do we want to do this? Can we reinvent, how we do things in a way that actually doesn't have to involve sacrificing, like someone having to sacrifice? And I think there is this sort of my worry is that the utilitarian framework ends up kind of in a way where people don't, where you end up kind of just saying, oh, well, that's the sacrifice that had to be made. And I think that's a response that's really lacking in empathy and imagination.
That's an excellent point. I was so alarmed, and I'm not in the US, 2 of you are, but reading about what's happening in Georgia and a lot of people concluding that this is all about not having to pay people unemployment. So if I'm a hair salon and I say, come back to work, otherwise you don't get your unemployment check. I'm concerned about big business and the ethics there.
Yeah, I mean, ethics in general. Yeah, sorry, never.
Oh, you guys can
No,
both take it.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Anish.
Okay. So the thing I was about to say was like the resource allocation problem globally always has been a problem. In many ways, the way I think about, this pandemic is in some countries, say, take the case of India. We don't know what the population below the poverty line is, right? And if you look at the number of death because of starvation and other things is significant. And then there is this difference between resource allocation. If you spend $1 in sub-Saharan Africa, you can get an anti-malarial net and you can actually save a life, right? And that's the value of life in that sense. And if you look at NICE, the National Institute of Clinical Excellence, it has a value for 1 year of healthy life of an individual in the UK. And it is like a very crazy way of measuring things. We will end up having to do something like this for life of humanity globally. And it will be very, very unfair. And I think people like Marcia and Barron and Vinay and other people who are thinking about this, they should probably put it out there so people can actually discuss this. This is a good time to think about this, because like this, at the end of the day, is all about resource optimization. When we talk about flattening the curve, what is it all about? The cost it takes for somebody to go through med school to be trained and be an interventionist, the cost to actually have a ventilator, a cost to have, it's a very resource intensive process. If you have one patient in ITU, you have at least 3 shifts of people around you, the very least, okay? Plus somebody to look after you on your ventilator. This is like incredibly resource intensive, like a 5 person per person at least, okay? This is just, in my mind, is very much a question of resource allocation.
Guns and power, right? Are we going to take care of homeless people, or are we going to provide more ventilators?
Absolutely, this is the question.
One piece of critical perspective here is that the death toll from COVID right now in America is 10% the number of people that die of smoking every year. Right, smoking kills about 500,000 Americans a year. COVID's killed what, about 50,000, maybe 60,000.
But the death is so much more horrible from COVID. Yeah.
Really?
You die alone, gasping for breath.
Just exactly like you do with smoking.
Yeah. Absolutely, that's what I was about to say.
Lung cancer.
But you're alone.
Yeah, whereas with lung cancer, you get lots of friends around. I mean,
I'm not
at a fundamental level. Like if we're serious about saving lives, we might want to start looking at tobacco as the thing that should not recover from this process.
Yeah, COPD, very much, what's going to happen at the end stage is pretty much the same. What we are having effectively you have an ARDS. So, the real question is, do you really value when you are being sedated, whether, I don't know, I've never heard a patient say to me, I've been sedated, but I knew what was happening around. So that will be an interesting question.
Truly. I saw, Nava, when you raised your light there for a second. Did you want to add something?
Sure. And I think that your example about Georgia, Gina, I think is interesting, because I think we spend a lot of time kind of having our attention drawn towards the big political changes. We did an analysis looking at mobility, so changes in mobility based on cell phone data. And we looked at about 65 million mobile phone traces. And
that was you? I saw that study. You can see the states where people are moving. That was a wonderful study.
Thanks. And so one of the things we found was that we looked at the counties in the United States. We have about 3,000 of them, where the stay-at-home orders had been put into place, and counties where it had not. And from a baseline pre-COVID time period, the amount of decline, this was like the analysis period, I think went through April 17th. So it's a couple weeks old now, but the decrease in mobility in places with government restrictions was about 60%. In the places without the restrictions, it was about 50%. So even though there was, we think that the legal positioning has a lot to do with the structural environment in which people and the behaviors happen. In practice with this, we're actually seeing a lot of voluntary sequestration. So I find comfort in that these politicians who we may not agree with, are the people are actually being smarter than the politicians. And so I don't know how much that's going to hold over the springtime, over the warmer weather and people want to get outside, but I think at least that's one data point to kind of
real
temper
quick question for you,
Mhm.
Navarun, on that study, because I shared that pretty widely over social, and some people came back and said, yeah, well, the states, where the counties where people are moving around more, they're rural areas where they're not a mile away from the grocery store.
Mhm.
I don't
Absolutely.
know that. It's my impression that there's a Walmart on every corner in the U.S.
Yeah. So the
Perhaps
analysis, I'm not sure which analysis you shared, but the one that we did adjusted for rurality, and then we cross-referenced the data with the Google location services data to look at pharmacy and grocery utilization, and restaurant and bar utilization and things like that, and the association still held. So even looking at within areas with the same level of rurality or urbanicity, the association still held. So I agree. That is a very reasonable question, but I think it's something that we can handle if you compare within levels of rurality.
So interesting. Mircea, you wanted to add?
Oh, no, I think the point is actually addressed very well by Navarun, but thank you.
If your light goes on, I ask you. I see Ben joined us.
Yeah, I did join, but I'm just listening. I'm really enjoying the diversity of views, and I think you've done an amazing job of guiding this dialogue in such an interesting direction. I mean,
Self-propelling.
I think,
they guide themselves beautifully here.
yeah,
I have a question
this
here.
has been a real conversation, which not every panel ends up being, as all of us know. So yeah, I might poke in with one variation on a question that was already asked. So, thinking about agent-based modeling, which is the theme that caused me to get the crazy idea to convene all of you amazing people here, and we're working on some agent-based models of COVID now, and I'll talk a little bit about that in my final talk after this one. And one interesting thing we're trying to do is get more intelligence into the agents in an agent-based simulation, partly because we're AI guys, so we think every problem can be solved by AI. But there's some argument that can help guide the simulations in some valuable way. So yeah, I think if you have any sort of final words of wisdom to offer those of us crazy enough to be building agent-based models and sort of collecting data to feed these agent-based models and so forth, and both for societies as a whole and for, say, enterprises that are approaching us and want help doing agent-based modeling of, how specifically does COVID-19 affect their own enterprise, well, it's different offices and its supply chains and so forth. I mean, what do you have to say that might actually be useful to me, for example, or anyone else pursuing agent-based modeling?
Yeah, that's good. And we can close that way if you guys can go round robin and address that question. And also, I'd like to hear what's keeping you awake at night regarding simulations here.
So I have a very specific concern with the simulations, which is I think we're modeling entirely the wrong thing, right? Agent-based modeling, typically you think of the agents as being human beings and the virus is just a flag on a human being. But without a doubt, the most dangerous place in my building is my elevator, whether or not anybody else is in there or not. And a conventional agent-based model is not going to indicate that that elevator exists. See what I'm saying? So same thing with all this contact tracing work, which is being done by Google and Apple. It's not really about who's in the room with you. It's about who's in the room before you. So if the agent is seen as being the virus and it's moving through space, including bodies, you get a very different model than if you require people to have actually met each other for there to be contamination. So, I think that it's very important when we think of contact tracing, we need to get rid of contact tracing, and we need to think in terms of contagion tracing.
Just a quick comment, in Hong Kong, we do that. We have a contact tracing database we can all access, and you can see not only who's given the disease to who, but you can see where it happened.
Yeah.
And it'll flag Starbucks in Taipo yesterday, right?
Boom.
Somebody was infected, and I think, okay, I'm not going to Starbucks for a couple of weeks.
That's what you want. That's what
and
you
that's,
want.
We've been doing that since mid-January.
Yeah, and you wonder why it's under control over there.
Yeah, I mean, Hong Kong has done a lot of things right, and I mean, in terms of the modeling, yeah, I mean, I think you're correct. The simplest sort of agent-based model won't get you much more than the simple differential equations model, and I mean, you can refine the models almost indefinitely. I mean, you can model the different types of virus that are out there also, and it is hard. It's hard to make models this refined. On the other hand, if we're talking about something costing tens of trillions of dollars, it's worth trying something hard, even if it might save only 1% of that money being spent, right?
Yeah. All right. Final thoughts. Mircea, you have your light on.
Oh, I don't know what triggers this light, but I'm happy to mention my thoughts.
Maybe you're just breathing hard or something. It's your mic.
Yeah, my biggest takeaway, and I think that the biggest sort of advice I can give to anyone doing this modeling is to really pay close attention to the sensitivity of their parameters. And as I was saying, think carefully about, as was said by Vinay, think carefully about, do you need space to be explicit there, or can you make it sort of implicit? Think about how these different changes would affect your model. And I think, I approach things a lot from a data science and also a machine learning type of perspective on data. And I think, it's funny that academically we always think like, oh, there's this model, and like, yeah, like you should have, like you think that you'll end up with this Swiss Army knife, you'll know the exact tool for the right job. But actually it'll come down to, there are often 10 different approaches that could be valid for the problem. And you have to try them and see, how does the result change out of that? And can you get can you do basically a meta-analysis of the simulations and the models that you're building to understand the confidence of what you're actually doing there?
Hey, Mircea, just really quick, as an ecologist, are you optimistic at all about the sudden healing of the earth as everybody's been staying home, or that it may change some of our habits? Or as a financial services guy, not a chance, soon we'll be polluted again? Because you are both.
Yeah.
It's a tricky one.
I think this has actually given us a very good opportunity to rethink and reinvent the economic institutions that we have, and how we go about the world and think about our business. I can say, from a personal perspective, you can see that a lot of the businesses of the world have been operating under a paradigm that really traces back to the 19th century industrial age of, well, everyone has to come into the office, they got to punch in the time card, and then I sit at my computer where I produce results at some known rate per hour, and then I clock out, and then productivity ends, which is it's comical to think about work that way in the information age and the knowledge economy. And I think, at least for certain parts of our society, we can use this as an opportunity to really reinvent the way that we work. Do you need to do that commute every day for 45 minutes to get to the office and then come back? This has probably been a good experiment to show that, hopefully you don't, and you can
or fly cross country for a dinner. I mean, I've flown to Japan before for an evening speaking engagement. It seems kind of silly. But,
exactly.
Okay. Thank you, Mircea. Who else has a final thought? Vinay, you look like you're deep in thought.
Yeah, I mean, so my work was on really bad stuff, right? Like, 30% fatality rate, civilization collapses in year one kind of things. Most of those concerns are totally irrelevant to this situation. Like, that's just, scare stories from the old days. But it is amazing how quickly we're seeing knock-ons on food. It's amazing how quickly we're seeing knock-ons in terms of large groups of armed rednecks. And that sort of stuff is super hard to model in any kind of numeric way. What you need is a kind of dystopian paranoid fantasy alert that you just kind of check Google News to see whether any of the bad things that you're worrying about are beginning to weak signal. And I feel like we are largely misunderstanding why COVID is a problem, right? In reasonably well-organized societies, they got a lid on COVID very quickly. Vietnam is, what, 80 million people, and they had 0 deaths, allegedly. You know, like, there are definitely a whole bunch of places that really got on top of this, and it wasn't a big deal, and there you go. Then there are all the places where it's been a total shambles. And I think we have to note that that is about social immune systems. Right? Like, the government is in some sense part of the immune system of the body politic. When the government is dysfunctional, the immune system of the body politic is dysfunctional. And we've got, I mean, like, when I was doing this stuff professionally, I would not have worked on a disease with 1% CFR. It just wasn't worth doing. It's not a threat to the stability of society. If you vaguely have your shit together, you won't even notice that happening, right? And the fact that it's stressing our societies to breaking point is because of gigantic pre-existing fragilities that we've watched building up since 2008 and have been pretending aren't happening. So,
that's right. When you say we could never have simulated armed rednecks, you know, marching on Michigan, we could simulate, however, what would happen if those armed rednecks weren't armed rednecks, but were, for instance, African Americans that were armed marching. Yeah. What would have happened then?
Well, welcome, COINTELPRO and all the rest of that shenanigan, right? Yeah. All those guys that got whacked in Ferguson in the few years following their protests. So, you know,
so this puts a spotlight on all those inequalities as well as the problems with the, you know, health system.
Inequalities, fragilities, truths that we've been ignoring. Like, you know, the US has shown many of the symptoms of being a failing state really since 2008. Right?
Yes.
Russia, at the height of the period that we think of as the Soviet collapse, you didn't see that in Moscow at all, right? Moscow was still Moscow. New York is still New York. It was, you know, like rural Siberia that you really saw people's life expectancy falling off a cliff, just like you do in Hicksville, USA, with the opiate epidemic. Okay. So, you know, I think that it's important for us to model this as the societies where a relatively small stressor like COVID is causing an absolute meltdown are the societies which were already pre-existingly diseased. What you're seeing is a pre-existing condition of social decline and government corruption, which then takes this relatively mild infection and turns it into a disaster.
Sobering thought. Any final words, Anish?
Yeah, I was about to say, sorry, you know, I probably will have to disagree with Vinay on all of this. So I agree.
Now's the time to do it.
Yeah, every man has a right to be wrong.
That's right.
Absolutely. So the reason I say this is just based on the data that I've seen. I've done a bit of work on existential threat and information hazards previously, and I published something on this with something from Future Humanities Institute. So for me, this doesn't come, as you rightly pointed out, none of this really comes to anywhere near. But the real way the societies collapse very much has to do with, I think, not really economic indicators. It's more to do with the demographic distribution. Because like, if I am looking at India, India has probably a real collapse of institution happening. Probably, I mean, I can't say it in that hard sense, but you know what I'm saying. Like, literally, you know, the so-called right-wing activism has reached a point where a lot of the things are collapsing, right?
Oh yeah.
But if you look at the deaths happening there, that's nothing. You know, like, I'm shocked. I look at all the numbers and I go, how do we explain this, right? In other parts of the world, like you know, Singapore, look at Korea, look at Japan, I can see the numbers, I can see where things are happening. You know, it actually shows something. Like, in a way, is this population distribution, resource allocation across the population, and how they all use various resources, and population's expectation of life, right? And the outcomes of healthcare. These are the things that seem to be really being challenged, as I see it, in different parts of the world. In the parts of the world where this is not taken for granted, I think, the changes that will happen is minimal. So I don't foresee like a massive collapse in Africa. And in the same way that is happening in India, slightly worse the case in Pakistan, Bangladesh, that's what I'm seeing in numbers, and that's what I expect. So, I'm not sure whether it has anything to do with the regimes, but more to do with other, I don't know, externalities in that sense.
That's right. Thank you, Anish. I guess our final word now comes from our resident epidemiologist here, Navarun Dasgupta. What do you think? What do you want us to come away with, Navarun?
Well, for the modelers, I would say pay attention to the extremes, because I think both in terms of good and bad, that while the central balance is something we feel confident about, we're in a situation where we may be, the extremes may carry the day. So.
Yeah. I think we probably should wrap up, huh, Ben? I want to thank all of these panelists, just extraordinary insights. And I think some of your points of disagreement are ones that we'll all kind of reflect on now in coming days and weeks as we watch this pandemic unfold. I want to thank Dr. Mircea Davidescu for joining us, Vinay Gupta, bottom center, or he was anyway. Now, Dr. Navarun Dasgupta, and of course, Dr. Anish Mohammed up in the upper left. Thanks, you guys, for such a engaging and energetic conversation. I really appreciate it. And thanks to our audience for the questions, too.
Thank you.
Ben?
Yeah, thanks everyone for joining the panel, and thanks to Gina for a fantastic job of moderating.
Thanks, Ben. I'm happy to do it.
Good session, all y'all.
Nice to meet you guys. Take care.
That's it.
Hang in there, audience. Remember, don't breathe anything.
That's right. Wear a mask.
Fixes everything.
Wash your hands.
Positive air pressure respirators. That's what we want. Cheap helmets for everybody.
That's right. Don't take any wooden nickels.
Just wear the helmet and the little waist belt with the pipe. I'm telling you, helmets. It's the answer to all this. No social distancing, only helmets.
Wear a helmet. Bye, you guys. Thanks very much. I'll be in contact.